An impossible battle, 40,000 soldiers facing 100,000. What strategy did Alexander use to win? 333 BC. Issus Alexander led around 40,000 Macedonian troops against more than 80,000 Persian soldiers under King Darius III. The Persian army outnumbered them nearly 2-1, and they believed victory was only a matter of time. But the battlefield was trapped between mountains and the Seni. The massive Persian army couldn't fully deploy. Their greatest advantage became their biggest weakness. So how would Alexander move his army? What strategy would he use to win this battle? 333 BC. After crossing into Asia, Alexander was no longer defending Greece. He was invading an empire. In 334 BC, Alexander the Great crossed the Hellespont, entering Persian territory for the first time. Ahead of him stretched the vast Persian Empire, a kingdom that ruled lands from Egypt to India. No Greek army had ever attempted such a campaign, but Alexander moved forward. His army numbered around 40,000 men, 30,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, a disciplined army, hardened by years of war. At the center of his force stood the Macedonian phalanx, rows of soldiers holding long spears, nearly 6 meters in length, slow, but nearly unstoppable when advancing together. On the right wing, Alexander led the companion cavalry, elite horsemen, fast, aggressive, and loyal only to their king. Alexander did not plan to slowly conquer Persia. He intended to strike at the heart of the empire. After his first victory, at the Battle of Granicus, Persian resistance in Asia Minor began to collapse. City after city opened their gates. Some surrendered peacefully, others resisted and were defeated. Alexander moved south, securing the Mediterranean coastline. This was not accidental. The Persian navy was still powerful. If Alexander left coastal cities behind him, Persian fleets could attack his supply lines, so Alexander captured them, one by one. Miletus, Halicarnassus, and the cities of western Asia Minor. With each victory, Alexander moved deeper into Persian territory, and with each step, the danger increased. Meanwhile, news reached Darius III. A young Macedonian king was defeating Persian governors and advancing across Asia. Darius could no longer ignore the threat. He began assembling a massive army from across the Persian Empire. Soldiers were called, cavalry from Iran, archers from the eastern provinces, infantry from Mesopotamia, and most dangerous of all, Greek mercenaries, experienced soldiers who understood Macedonian tactics. Darius now commanded one of the largest armies of his time, 80,000, possibly up to 100,000 men, an overwhelming force prepared to crush Alexander. Darius originally chose a wide-open plain in Syria, a battlefield, perfect for cavalry, perfect for surrounding Alexander. If Alexander entered this battlefield, he would be outnumbered and overwhelmed. But Alexander never came. Instead, Alexander marched south, along the Mediterranean coast. Each day, Alexander captured more territory. Darius grew impatient, and then he made a bold decision. Instead of waiting, Darius marched his entire army north, through narrow mountain passes, difficult terrain, dangerous for such a large force. Moving tens of thousands of soldiers through confined mountain roads was extremely risky. But Darius pushed forward, and then he achieved something unexpected. Darius moved behind Alexander. The Persian army suddenly appeared near the small coastal plain of Issus. Alexander's supply lines were now cut. His communication with Greece severed. For the first time, Alexander was trapped. Darius believed he had cornered the young king. But there was one problem. The battlefield near Issus was narrow, mountains behind, sea in front. The massive Persian army could not fully deploy. The advantage of numbers was disappearing. Alexander received the news and immediately turned his army around. Two kings, two armies were now marching toward their first confrontation. History was about to change. As Alexander the Great turned his army north, the situation became increasingly dangerous. Behind him was the Persian army. Ahead of him, only narrow roads and rugged terrain. Alexander moved quickly. Speed was now his greatest weapon. If he delayed, Darius could reinforce his position. If he moved fast, he could force a battle before the Persian army fully deployed. As Alexander approached Issus, the terrain began to change. The wide plains disappeared. Instead, mountains rose sharply to the east, to the west. The Mediterranean Sea stretched along the coast. Between them lay a narrow strip of land. This was the battlefield, a confined coastal plain, barely wide enough for two massive armies. For Darius, this was a problem. His greatest advantage was numbers, but here numbers meant little. Thousands of Persian soldiers were still marching behind. Many units could not even reach the front lines. The largest army in the world was trapped by geography. At the center of the battlefield flowed the Pinarus River, a small river, but with steep banks. The ground near the river was uneven, rocky, difficult to cross. This natural barrier gave Darius a defensive position. He quickly organized his army. Greek mercenaries were placed at the center. These were experienced soldiers, veterans of many wars. They were expected to hold the line against the Macedonian phalanx. Behind them, Persian infantry formed deeper lines. On the right wing, Persian cavalry moved toward the coast, thousands of horsemen preparing to outflank Alexander. On the left, more cavalry, positioned near the mountains. Darius intended to surround the Macedonian army. At the rear, Darius stood. On his royal chariot, tall banners, golden armor, royal guards surrounding him. From there, he could see the entire battlefield. He believed victory was close. Meanwhile, Alexander rode forward. He carefully studied the terrain. He saw the narrow plain. He saw the river. He saw the Persian army stretching across the battlefield. This would be a dangerous fight. Alexander gathered his generals, among them Parmenion, his most experienced commander. Alexander explained his plan. The phalanx would hold the center. Parmenion would defend the left flank. Alexander himself would command the right wing with the companion cavalry. This was his strongest force. Alexander intended to strike decisively, not slowly, not cautiously, but with speed and precision. The two armies now faced each other. Thousands of soldiers, shields raised, spears ready. The wind moved across the battlefield. Dust filled the air. The tension was unbearable. The Battle of Issus was about to begin. The two armies now stood face to face. On one side, Alexander the Great and the Macedonian army. On the other, Darius III and the vast Persian force. Between them flowed the Pinarus River. The river was not wide, but the banks were steep and uneven. Crossing it would slow any advancing army. Darius knew this. He positioned his strongest troops at the center. Greek mercenaries, veterans of many wars. Behind them, Persian infantry. On both flanks, thousands of Persian cavalry. Darius stood behind the lines, on his royal chariot, confident that Alexander would struggle to cross the river. Alexander studied the battlefield. He understood the danger, the river, the steep banks, the experienced Greek mercenaries. This would not be an easy attack. Still, Alexander decided to move forward. He gave the order. The Macedonian army advanced. The phalanx moved first. Rows of soldiers, with long sarissas, stepped toward the river. The ground became rough, rocks, mud, uneven terrain. The phalanx formation began to stretch and separate. This was dangerous. The strength of the phalanx was its unity. Now, that unity was weakening. As the Macedonians entered the river, Persian archers opened fire. Arrows filled the air. Some soldiers fell. Others raised their shields. The army kept moving, slowly. The Macedonian soldiers crossed the river. But as they climbed the far bank, the Greek mercenaries attacked. They moved forward aggressively. Spears lowered, shields raised. They slammed into the Macedonian phalanx. The fighting became intense. Spears clashed, shields pushed together. Soldiers fought at close range. The Macedonian center began to struggle. Some units were pushed backward. The battle became dangerous. For the first time, the Macedonian line was under serious pressure. At the same time, on the Macedonian left flank, Parmenion was facing heavy Persian cavalry. The coastline limited his ability to maneuver. Persian cavalry attacked repeatedly. Parmenion's troops were pushed back. The Macedonian left wing was in danger. If the Persians broke through, they could surround Alexander's army. The situation was becoming critical. But on the right wing, Alexander prepared his decisive move. The companion cavalry formed into wedge formation, elite horsemen ready to charge. Alexander lowered his spear. Then he gave the command. The cavalry charged forward. Hooves thundered across the battlefield. They struck the Persian left flank with tremendous force. The collision was violent. Persian cavalry fought back, but Alexander led from the front. His presence inspired his men. The Macedonian cavalry pushed forward. Slowly, the Persian line began to weaken. Then, a gap appeared, a small opening. In the Persian formation, Alexander saw it immediately. Through that gap, he saw the royal position, the chariot of Darius III. Alexander made his decision. He would charge directly at the Persian king. A bold move, a dangerous move, but one that could end the battle. Alexander gathered his cavalry and prepared for the charge that would decide everything. Alexander the Great saw the moment. The Persian left wing was weakening. The cavalry clash had created a gap. This was exactly what Alexander had been waiting for. He immediately reorganized his cavalry. The companion cavalry formed into a wedge. Alexander at the front, elite horsemen behind him. This formation was designed to break enemy lines. Alexander lowered his spear. Then he gave the command. The cavalry charged forward. The impact was immediate. The Macedonian cavalry slammed into the Persian line. Persian infantry tried to hold their ground, but the wedge formation forced its way forward. Alexander fought at the front, striking with his spear. His bodyguards protected his sides. The companion cavalry pressed behind him. The Persian line started to bend. Then it began to break. Persian nobles and royal guards moved forward to stop Alexander. These were elite warriors. They fought fiercely. The fighting became intense. Horses collided, spears shattered, men fell from their saddles. Alexander continued pushing forward. He refused to stop. The gap widened. The Persian line split apart. From his chariot, Darius III could now see Alexander approaching. The Macedonian cavalry was moving directly toward him. The royal guard formed a defensive line. They fought desperately, but Alexander's momentum was too strong. The Macedonian cavalry broke through. The distance between Alexander and Darius became dangerously short. For a brief moment, Darius faced direct danger. Alexander was closing in. The Persian king could see the Macedonian cavalry approaching. The royal chariot became vulnerable. Then, Darius made his decision. He turned his chariot and began to retreat. Once Darius fled, the Persian army saw their king leaving. Panic spread quickly. Confidence collapsed. Persian soldiers began to retreat. Some ran. Others dropped their weapons. The Persian line collapsed. The retreat turned into chaos. Alexander pushed forward. The Macedonian cavalry pursued. The Persian army was now in full retreat. But the battle was not yet over. On the Macedonian left flank, Parmenion was still under heavy pressure. Persian cavalry were still fighting. Alexander now faced a decision: continue pursuing Darius or turn back to help his army. Alexander chose. He turned his cavalry and rode back toward the battlefield. The final stage of the Battle of Issus was about to begin. As Alexander the Great turned back from pursuing Darius III, the battle was still unfolding. On the Macedonian left wing, Parmenion was still fighting for survival. Persian cavalry continued their attack. They pressed hard, attempting to break through. The Macedonian left flank was slowly being pushed back. The coastline limited movement. There was little room to maneuver. If the Persian cavalry broke through, they could strike the Macedonian center. From behind, the battle was still dangerous. Alexander rode quickly across the battlefield. The companion cavalry followed closely behind. Dust filled the air. The sound of fighting still echoed across the narrow plain. Alexander reached the left flank. Without hesitation, he launched another attack. The Macedonian cavalry struck from the side. The sudden attack surprised the Persian cavalry. They were already engaged with Parmenion's forces. Now, they were attacked from another direction. The Persian cavalry began to lose cohesion. The fighting intensified. Horses collided. Spears struck armor. Soldiers fell to the ground. Alexander led the charge. Once again, the companion cavalry pressed forward, slowly. The Persian cavalry began to retreat. Then, the retreat turned into disorder. The Persian cavalry broke. They began to flee. Once the cavalry fled, the remaining Persian infantry was exposed. The Macedonian army advanced. The Persian line collapsed completely. Across the battlefield, Persian soldiers were already retreating. Word spread quickly. The king had fled. Darius III was gone. Morale collapsed. Units broke apart. Thousands of Persian soldiers dropped their weapons. Some fled toward the mountains. Others ran toward the river. The narrow terrain turned retreat into chaos. Many soldiers were trapped. Others were cut down. While fleeing, the Persian army was completely defeated. As the sun began to set, the fighting slowly ended. The battlefield belonged to Alexander. Thousands of Persian soldiers lay scattered across the field. Others had fled into the darkness. Alexander moved forward toward the Persian camp. There, he made an unexpected discovery. The royal family of Darius had been left behind. His mother, his wife, his daughters. They feared the worst, but Alexander ordered that they be treated with respect. They were not harmed, they were protected. This decision earned Alexander respect across the empire. The Battle of Issus was a decisive victory. Alexander had defeated the Persian king for the first time. The road into the Persian Empire was now open. After Issus, Alexander was no longer just a young conqueror. He had become a threat to one of the greatest empires in history, and the war was far from over.